The bell above the door of Harbor Light Books chimed softly, the sound barely louder than a breath. It wasn't sharp or demanding. It simply announced that someone had arrived and then stepped aside, allowing the quiet to return. Mara Ellison always noticed it. She stood behind the counter with both hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea, letting the warmth seep into her palms. Outside the front window, the late afternoon light stretched lazily across the narrow coastal road and spilled toward the sea. The dune grass bent and straightened in the breeze, and beyond it the ocean moved with steady patience, waves folding back into themselves as if they had learned long ago there was no need to hurry. Harbor Cove felt like that, too. A town that didn't rush you. A town that didn't ask you to explain why you'd come or how long you planned to stay. Mara had arrived there 7 years earlier with one suitcase and a heart that felt thin and overused. She'd told herself it would be temporary. A season, maybe 2. Just long enough to rest. Just long enough to remember how to breathe without bracing herself for disappointment. But the town had been gentle with her. And then there was the bookstore. Harbor Light Books had once belonged to Eleanor Finch, a woman who believed that stories could hold people together when life threatened to pull them apart. Eleanor believed that books were a kind of shelter, and that no one should ever be rushed while choosing one. When she retired, she sold the shop to Mara for far less than it was worth, and said only, "This place needs someone who listens." Mara had listened. The shop was narrow and deep, with shelves reaching nearly to the ceiling and packed tightly with books that smelled of paper, salt air, and time. A rolling ladder clicked softly when it moved. Near the back sat a faded blue armchair beside a small lamp whose light felt warmer than it should have been. It was a place meant for lingering, for pausing, for breathing. It was a place where Mara felt steady. The bell chimed again. Mara looked up, expecting a familiar face. Mrs. Henley from down the street, or one of the teenagers who pretended not to like poetry. Instead, a man stood just inside the doorway, hesitating as though he wasn't entirely sure he belonged there. He held the door open a moment longer than necessary. He was tall, with dark hair threaded lightly with silver at the temples, dressed simply in a jacket that looked practical rather than fashionable. There was something careful about the way he stood, like someone who had learned not to take up more space than needed. When his eyes met Mara's, he gave a small, uncertain smile. "Sorry," he said, "I wasn't sure if you were still open." "We are," Mara replied gently, "another half hour." "Good," he said, and the relief in his voice sounded real. "I've walked past a few times and kept meaning to come in." He stepped fully inside, letting the door close behind him. The bell settled into silence again. Mara watched him move through the store slowly, his fingers brushing the spines of books as if greeting old friends. He paused often, reading titles, sometimes pulling a book free only to slide it back moments later. He moved with a quiet reverence that told her he understood places like this, understood that they mattered. After a while, he approached the counter holding a thin paperback with a creased spine. "Have you read this?" he asked. Mara glanced at the cover and smiled. "Yes, a couple of times." "Is it good?" She considered the question carefully. "It's gentle," she said. "It doesn't rush you. It lets things unfold when they're ready." Something softened in his expression. "That sounds like exactly what I need." He bought the book, thanked her, and turned to leave, but paused as if remembering something important. "I'm Jonah," he said. "I just moved here." "Mara," she replied. "Welcome to Harbor Cove." "Thank you," he said, his smile lingering just a second longer before he stepped outside. The bell chimed softly behind him. For the rest of the evening, Mara found herself thinking about the way he'd looked at the shelves, like they held something fragile and valuable. Jonah returned the next day, and the day after that. Sometimes he bought books, sometimes he didn't. Sometimes he asked questions that made Mara pause before answering. Other times they exchanged only a few words before he wandered back into the quiet aisles. It became a rhythm neither of them named. Jonah worked remotely as an architect. He had left a city that no longer fit him and come to Harbor Cove looking for quiet. Mara learned this in pieces, gathered over days and weeks, like shells collected from the shoreline. What she noticed most was the way he listened. He didn't rush her words, he didn't interrupt. He made conversation feel like something shared rather than performed. As autumn edged its way into town, Jonah's visits grew longer. He lingered near the counter sometimes, talking about books he loved or places he'd lived. Mara found herself sharing things she usually kept to herself. Small memories, quiet thoughts, pieces of her past that felt safe in his presence. One evening, as dusk softened the sky into shades of lavender and blue, Jonah stayed even after choosing a book. "Can I ask you something?" he said, shifting slightly as if nervous. "Course. Would you like to have coffee with me sometime?" He hesitated, not as a customer, just as me. Mara felt a gentle warmth bloom in her chest, not sudden, not overwhelming, just steady and calm, like the tide coming in. "I'd like that," she said. Jonah smiled, and this time there was something brighter there, something hopeful. As he left, the bell chimed again. And for the first time in a long while, Mara felt as though something new had begun. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, the way the most lasting things often do. They met for coffee the next afternoon. The cafe sat right next to the bookstore, as if the two places had grown up together. It was small and softly worn, with mismatched chairs, round wooden tables, and windows that fogged easily when the weather cooled. The scent of coffee and baked bread hung in the air like something familiar and kind. Mara arrived a few minutes early out of habit. She chose a table near the window, set her bag at her feet, and wrapped her hands around a warm mug. She told herself she wasn't nervous. She told herself this was simply coffee. When the door opened and Jonah stepped inside, she felt the quiet awareness of him immediately. He spotted her and smiled, a little shy, a little pleased. He moved toward her table, shrugging out of his jacket. "Hi," he said, as if they hadn't spoken nearly every day for weeks. "Hi," Mara replied, smiling back. They ordered, then settled into their seats, the small round table between them. For a moment, neither spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable. Just new, like standing at the edge of something and taking a breath before stepping forward. "So," Jonah said finally, his voice warm, "this feels different." "It does," Mara agreed. Not heavy or not complicated, just intentional. Conversation found its rhythm easily after that. Jonah told her about his parents, his father who loved building things with his hands, his mother who read aloud every night until Jonah was well into his teens. He spoke about the city he'd left behind, about how the noise and pace had slowly worn him down without him realizing it. "It wasn't bad," he said. "It just stopped feeling like home." Mara understood that kind of leaving. She told him about her grandmother, about long afternoons spent listening to stories at the kitchen table. She spoke carefully about the loss that had brought her to Harbor Cove, not the details, but the shape of it. How life could tilt quietly, without warning. Jonah listened without interrupting, his attention steady and open. "That must have taken courage," he said softly. "It took time," Mara replied. They lingered longer than either of them expected. When they finally stood to leave, the light outside had shifted, the day leaning toward evening. As they stepped out together, Jonah hesitated. "Would you like to walk for a bit?" he asked. "Down by the water?" Mara nodded. "I'd like that." They walked side by side along the familiar path, the ocean moving steadily beside them. They spoke in easy pieces, about favorite seasons, about routines, about small things that mattered. There were pauses, too, comfortable ones. Jonah noticed them first, the way Mara always slowed near the water, the way she breathed more deeply near the sea. Mara noticed how Jonah watched the horizon, thoughtful and still. Over the next weeks, time together became something they both quietly made room for. Jonah came to the bookstore not just as a customer anymore, but as someone who belonged there. Some evenings they stayed after closing, sitting on the floor between shelves with books spread around them. They took turns reading aloud, short passages, favorite paragraphs. Mara liked Jonah's voice. It was calm and steady, the kind that made even sad passages feel gentle. Sometimes they talked late into the evening. Other nights, they didn't talk much at all, simply sharing the quiet. Affection arrived without announcing itself. Jonah remembered how Mara took her tea, just honey, no milk. Mara noticed how Jonah always waited for her to finish speaking before responding, as if her words mattered enough to deserve patience. Their hands brushed sometimes, never quite accidental, never quite deliberate. Each time something warm flickered and settled. They were careful. Both of them had learned that rushing could bruise things that needed time. One evening, as autumn settled more fully over Harbor Cove, they sat on a weathered bench overlooking the harbor. Boats bobbed gently in the water, their lights blinking as dusk deepened. Jonah leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "Can I tell you something?" he asked quietly. Mara turned toward him. "Of course." "I sometimes worry," he said, choosing his words carefully, "that I started over too late." "Late for what?" she asked. "For finding something real again?" He let out a small breath. "For trusting myself to want it." Mara watched the water for a moment, then looked back at him. "I don't think real things disappear just because time passes," she said. "I think they wait until we're ready to see them." Jonah looked at her then, not quickly, not lightly. Something open and vulnerable settled into his expression. "I'm glad I found you," he said. The words stayed with her long after they parted that night. Still, neither of them crossed the invisible line. There were moments, almost moments. A glance held a second too long, a hand brushing another and not pulling away right away. Each time, something held them back, not fear, but care. Then the storm came. It rolled in suddenly one afternoon, dark clouds gathering over the water. Wind rattled the windows of Harbor Light Books, rain striking the glass hard enough to blur the view outside. Mara was alone in the shop, straightening shelves, when the lights flickered and went out. She stood still for a moment, listening to the rain, then moved calmly behind the counter and lit a candle. Its flame steadied quickly, casting soft shadows along the walls. The bell chimed. Mara looked up. Jonah stood in the doorway, rain-soaked and breathless, concern written plainly across his face. "I saw the lights go out," he said. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." Her chest warmed at the sight of him. "I'm fine," she said, "but I'm glad you're here." They locked the door and sat on the floor near the counter, the candle between them. Outside the storm raged, but inside the shop felt small and protected. They talked quietly at first, about the weather, about how quickly things could change. Then Jonah fell silent, staring at the flame. "There's something I should tell you," he said. Mara's heart beat a little faster. "Okay." "I've been holding back," he said, "not because I don't feel something, but because I do, and I didn't want to rush it or risk it." Mara felt the truth of his words settle gently inside her. "I've been doing the same," she admitted. Jonah reached out, his hand stopping just short of hers. "I don't want to miss this." Mara closed the small distance between them, their fingers intertwining. "Neither do I," she said. When Jonah leaned in, it was slow, giving her all the time in the world to decide. Their kiss was soft and unhurried, less a spark than a quiet agreement. Outside, the storm began to fade. Inside, something settled into place. From that evening forward, something unspoken shifted between Mara and Jonah. They moved closer. Not recklessly, not dramatically, but with the careful patience of people who had both learned how fragile good things could be. Their mornings became shared routines. Mara opened the bookstore, letting the bell announce the day as she always had. Jonah sometimes arrived just as she was arranging new books on the shelves, carrying a thermos of coffee or a small bouquet of wildflowers he had picked along the coastal path. They spoke in quiet, meandering conversations, sometimes about books, sometimes about nothing at all, their words falling easily like stones skipping across water. Some evenings, after the shop was closed, they sat together in the reading nook. Mara curled into the faded blue armchair with a blanket draped across her knees, while Jonah settled on the floor, leaning against the bookshelf. They read aloud to each other. Sometimes it was poetry, sometimes novels, sometimes passages they had discovered that week. Mara listened to Jonah's voice, steady and warm, like an anchor, and he listened to hers, attentive in a way that made even the smallest words feel important. They learned each other's rhythms. The way Mara always paused to savor her tea, the way Jonah lingered at the threshold before stepping inside, careful not to startle. They found comfort in these small, ordinary details, noticing the quiet ways they cared for each other without words. Winter arrived gently over Harbor Cove. Frost dusted the edges of the shop windows, and the sea took on a steel-blue quiet. The cafe next door smelled even more inviting with pastries fresh from the oven. Jonah would sometimes shovel Mara's steps before she left the house, leaving notes tucked into her coat pocket. A single line of poetry, a reminder to take her time, a drawing of a tiny bird in flight. Mara, in turn, left small things in Jonah's bag. A favorite tea, a pressed leaf from the bookstore's reading nook, a page torn from a notebook with a thought she wanted to share. They weren't in a rush to label what had begun between them. Words like love and together were understood, not announced. Their affection was steady and soft, the kind that grew quietly, imperceptibly, until it was undeniable. There were still quiet doubts sometimes, lingering fears from past hurts, but they shared them without judgment. Jonah spoke of his previous marriage, a chapter that ended without bitterness but left a subtle ache, the memory of expectations unfulfilled. Mara spoke of love she had lost not because of someone else, but because life sometimes changed in ways no one could control. They acknowledged these things, then returned to the present, finding in each other a sense of safety they had not thought possible. One early spring morning, the sky pale and the air crisp, they decided to walk along the beach. The tide was low, the sand wet and smooth beneath their feet, and the water reflected the soft sunlight in tiny glittering fragments. Jonah stopped and turned toward Mara. "I don't know exactly what the future will look like," he said, his voice low and earnest, "but I do know that I want to walk into it with you." Mara felt a warmth spread through her chest, steady and steadying. She took his hands in hers. "I do too," she said, smiling, eyes meeting his. For a long while, they simply stood there, the sound of the waves mingling with the quiet rhythm of their breathing. Neither felt the need to rush. There was no sudden declaration, no dramatic gesture, just an acknowledgement, calm and complete, that they had found each other in a way that mattered. Days blended into weeks. Spring deepened, bringing soft green to the dunes and the scent of blooming wildflowers along the coastal paths. Mara and Jonah continued their routines, the rhythms of their companionship, weaving naturally into the fabric of their lives. They had mornings of shared coffee, afternoons spent browsing shelves and reading aloud, evenings walking along the water or sitting quietly at the cafe. And slowly, as the seasons turned, they began to envision a future together, not imagined in grand schemes, but built in small, intentional steps. Mara began arranging books with Jonah's input, discussing which titles might resonate with customers, and Jonah in turn included Mara in sketches for small renovations he considered for the shop. It was mundane in the most meaningful way, a testament that they had made room for each other, steadily and without pretense. The first time Mara realized she loved him, it wasn't with fireworks or a single overwhelming moment. It was while she watched him quietly listening to a customer, the sun falling across his face just right, the crease at the corner of his eyes softening as he smiled at the question. She felt the words settle in her chest, gentle and certain. Jonah realized the same thing on an evening in the reading nook, when Mara laughed at something small he had said, and the sound, familiar and true, filled the quiet space with warmth. There was no grand declaration, just the subtle acknowledgement that life felt fuller, steadier, better with her in it. They marked their one-year anniversary with a simple evening by the harbor. A few small lanterns lined the edge of the water, casting a soft glow across the rippling surface. Jonah held Mara's hand and said nothing for several minutes, letting the quiet stretch between them. Then, gently, he pressed his forehead to hers. "I'm glad we waited," he said, "for everything, for the small moments, the quiet ones, the ones that brought us here." Mara smiled, resting her hand against his cheek. "Me too." And in that simple acknowledgement, love felt infinite and ordinary all at once. As years passed, their life in Harbor Cove settled into a gentle routine. The bookstore thrived under their shared care, a place that became more than just shelves of books. It became a home, a refuge, a testament to patience and attention. Jonah continued to design small projects, often sharing ideas with Mara, who loved helping him think them through. They continued their evening walks along the beach, their hands brushing naturally as the tide washed in and out. There were quiet mornings when Jonah would wake before Mara, brewing tea and leaving a cup on the counter beside her work area. There were lazy afternoons when Mara would read aloud to him while he sketched at the table. There were gentle conversations about hopes, small dreams, and everything they had yet to see in life. Life was simple, but it was full of understanding, trust, and the deep satisfaction of being known. One evening, as the sun set in soft hues of gold and rose over the water, Mara and Jonah walked along the beach, the sand cool beneath their feet. Jonah stopped, turned to Mara, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. They watched the waves together, the world around them calm and serene. "I can't imagine it any other way," Jonah said quietly. "Not the past, not the city, not the noise, just this, you, us." Mara felt the same. Her heart was full, steady, and certain. "Neither can I." The tide rolled in steadily, washing over the sand and leaving smooth stones in its wake. Mara and Jonah stood side by side, hands entwined, feeling the world shrink down to just the two of them. Their love had arrived slowly, like the tide itself, unnoticed at first, then undeniable, steady and enduring. It was not the kind of love that demanded fireworks or attention. It was quieter, gentler. It was the kind of love that could survive storms, winters, distance, and doubt. It was the kind of love that simply stayed, growing deeper with every ordinary day they shared. And so, beneath the patient gaze of the ocean, surrounded by the quiet charm of Harbor Cove, Mara and Jonah found something lasting. Something that felt like home. Something that was theirs, steady and unhurried, eternal in its quiet way. They walked back toward the town, the light fading behind them, and the world felt gentle. The future felt promising. The tide felt endless, and their hearts, entwined like the driftwood along the shore, finally knew they had found exactly what they were looking for, without even realizing they had been searching all along.